Sunday, 3rd of September, 1939. A very strange day today. It didn't start off well. We went to the late morning service at the Sailors' Church, like we normally do. Except I put on the blue dress I wore to Cousin Michael's christening last year, in the hope that Charlie Pearson would finally notice me. Of course he didn't. He wasn't even there. Instead, I had George Nichols grinning at me throughout the whole service. But his smile soon disappeared at the end, when the vicar played a live radio broadcast from the Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain.
I am speaking to you from the Cabinet Room at 10 Downing Street. This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.
War with Germany? My younger brother Harry is so excited about the prospect of it all, but he's only 11. I've no idea what's got into him. I guess those 8 years make a difference. I don't think Harry realises quite how serious this is. It didn't help that Dad kept on calling it a phony war as we walked home from the church. Dad doesn't think it will amount to much and that Hitler will back down soon enough. He won't want to take on the British, Dad said. But the look on Helga's face when she found out at supper this evening makes me wonder where this will all end. Helga's been living with us for several months now, after the Domestic Bureau placed her at our guest house. I've grown quite fond of her. She's been teaching me German and I've been helping her with her English. She says I'm a natural teacher, but I don't know about that. As soon as Dad told her about the radio broadcast, she wanted to get word to her husband Otto. He's still in the Kitchener refugee camp at Richborough. Helga and Otto had fled Germany in November last year, shortly after the Nazis started sending men to work camps. Poor Helga. It looks as though the war has followed her to Ramsgate. She was as white as a sheet. Mum spent half an hour trying to calm her down. Dad's promised to drive her out to the camp tomorrow after she's finished her chores. I expect Otto will have already heard by the time Helga's turned down all the beds. It seems futile, though. Who's going to come and stay at our guest house when Chamberlain's just declared war? Let's hope Dad's right. Let's hope this is all just a bit of nonsense and that things are back to normal by the new year. Friday, 12th of January, 1940. Things had progressed somewhat, but I think my initial fears were unfounded. Dad was right. The war hasn't been as bad as I had anticipated, though last week we were issued with our ration book. It's just a precaution, Mum says, but it means we'll no longer be able to offer guests a full English breakfast when the summer season starts. I'm curious to see how the ration book works, and I've asked Mum if I can go with her to Vianson. She said she's pleased to see I'm finally taking an interest in helping to run the guest house. I didn't tell her the real reason. Charlie. He used to do our deliveries, but he's just been promoted to store clerk. According to my friend Marjorie, that's why he hasn't been at the church recently. He's been going to the one on Vale Square instead because it's closer to the store. Marjorie said he remembers me well enough, though. She thinks I should go along to hear him rehearse with his band on Thursday afternoon. He plays the trombone, I think. Anyway, I'll soon find out. Marjorie's heard them play before at the Pavilion. She said they're quite good. I'll be the judge of that one. I don't mind, though, so long as they're not awful. I'm not really going to listen to the music. Actually, talking of music, it's been 3 days since the Dunbar Castle liner sank on the Goodwin Sands after hitting a mine. There are still a number of things being washed up on the shore, but yesterday Mr. Jenkins and his son found a grand piano. It was filled with water, and it took 6 of them to bail it out and get it off the beach. I doubt it'll ever play properly. It's been floating about for a few days and will be clogged with sand, seaweed and whatnot. Dad and Harry have had more success, though. Today they found some more of the South African state education pencils, and a rather large quantity of cigarettes. We spent most of the evening sitting by the fire, carefully unpicking them all and trying to dry out the tobacco on sheets of newspaper on the hearth. Dad's given some of the tobacco to Helga to pass on to Otto. But I think Dad plans on smoking the rest himself, even though Mum would rather he sold it. It's funny, really. I was so worried about this war, and yet so far, aside from the rationing, life's been pretty much the same. Except there are a few more soldiers milling around. But I'm not interested in them. I've got my eye on Charlie. Friday, 31st of May, 1940. I'm exhausted. The last few days have been a blur. It started on the 26th of May. We could hear muffled explosions in the distance as German planes dropped bombs across the channel on Dunkirk. You could see the clouds growing orange on the horizon as the town burned. For the first time, I was truly frightened. The Germans are now on our doorstep. Occasionally, we would catch a glimpse of a squadron of Spitfires heading out over the sea. But the fighting was far off in the distance. We could hear it, though. It wasn't until the next morning that we realised the extent of what was going on. At first, a few ships appeared, laden with men, soldiers from French and British Army. Then a few more. Then more still. By the end of the week, there was a whole fleet of paddle boats, cruisers, yachts, fishing boats, barges, anything that could float. They still come, wave after wave, pouring thousands upon thousands of tired and hungry troops onto the shore. They look a ragtag and sorry bunch. I don't think a single one of them was wearing a full uniform. Many of them had nothing but a blanket to protect their dignity. Morale among the troops is low. Some can hardly bring themselves to look us in the eye, but we did our best to feed and clothe them. Mum and I have been helping the girls from Lyon's restaurant to take tea and sandwiches down to the men as they come off the boats. They then get transported onto coaches, which run steadily back and forth from Ramsgate Station. Charlie isn't too happy about it. He doesn't like the idea of me being around all those desperate men. To think a few months ago, Charlie and I hardly spoke. But he's sweet, Charlie. When he saw for himself the state of our boys, he brought tea and sugar down from the store. I think most of the town had been down to the harbour at some point or other. Harry was in his element. He still doesn't get it. To him, it's all an adventure. He's been running around handing out biscuits and cigarettes and chatting to the troops. A good many of them humour him. I don't think Harry realises for one moment how many injured there are. Seeing a man with a shrapnel wound or an arm amputated is something of a novelty for him and his pals. But I suppose, like all of us, for a few days at least, he'll feel as though he's doing something for the war effort. We all are. I am immensely proud of my friends and neighbours, and how we've all pulled together to welcome our boys back home. I do hope they all get back to full strength soon, so they can head back over there and give Hitler what for. In the meantime, fingers crossed Hitler has no designs to come any further than northern France. Monday, 3rd of June, 1940. How strange it all is. Normally at this time of year we're starting to see the first of our summer season guests, but we're in the middle of a war zone. Soldiers keep on arriving from France. It's become an efficient process now. They are moved quickly through the town, onto buses, and then trains to London. a steady flow. I wonder how many more there can be, but they'll be safer away from the coast. It seems everyone is leaving too, even Harry. Mum was really upset, but Dad kept on telling her it was only temporary and Harry would be back home soon. I don't know why Harry can't stay. The tunnels are open. Harry's quite annoyed. He's going to be missing all the action. By the time Harry had to leave, Dad was already at the gasworks, so it was only Mum and I who were able to wave him off. We had to assemble on the playing fields at Chatham House School. By 10:45, there were thousands of children gathered there, and a good many parents too. Women with clipboards ushered the children around and pinned little labels on them, like they were cattle at a market. Then they hurried them off to the station, each child laden with a haversack, case, and gas mask. Harry must have fancied himself at parade. For when we reached the station, there were flags waving and people cheering, though this was primarily to raise the morale of the departing troops. There were 5 huge trains waiting for them, an endless line of carriages, some filled with soldiers and others filled with our brothers, sisters, sons and daughters. Harry didn't appear too fazed by it all. It is still very much an adventure for him. We've been told he's going to a place called Uttoxeter in Staffordshire, though none of us have heard of it before, which is a good sign, because if we haven't heard of it, you can be sure Hitler hasn't either. Anywhere must be far safer than here. Last night, Dad looked it up on the map. It's slap bang in the middle of the country. Hitler's got to get past a heck of a lot of Englishmen before he gets our children, Dad said. I think that made Mum feel a little bit better. But she and I both wept nonetheless as the train pulled out and Harry waved from a crowded window. When we got back to the guest house, there was even more sad news. Helga has also been told she is to be relocated. She leaves for London on Wednesday, and from there, who knows? Charlie says that some of the refugees from the Kitchener camp are to be shipped abroad too. I don't know who he heard that from, but at Vyse they always seem to get all the gossip. Saturday, 6th of July, 1940. Ramsgate is a town transformed. It's been almost a month to the day since the evacuation of Dunkirk, and ever since the focus has been on improving the town's defences. Up on the East Cliff there are 2 huge 6-inch guns, which look out over the channel. I've heard them practising and seen the shells hitting the water out over the horizon. The bandstand and dance floor, which only opened in May last year, is covered in camouflage netting, and there is a concrete observation post there now. We're not allowed anywhere near it. They've cordoned the whole area off with barbed wire. Charlie told me he played at the bandstand last summer, but I don't remember it. I do, however, remember the end-of-season dance there in September. Harry ran around terrorising everyone as usual. Oh, I do miss Harry. Even if he does get on my nerves every now and then, I'd rather he was here with us than out in the middle of nowhere. He has written, but it's not the same. He wouldn't recognise the place now. The town is beginning to look more like Chatham or Dover than a seaside town. Even the Merry England Pleasure Park's been swamped with military buildings and army huts. They call it HMS Fervent. I've seen soldiers moving in and out from the tunnels dug into the cliff. Dad said he remembers sheltering there during the First World War. He said there's an entire tunnel system down there, and that some of it dates back to Napoleonic times. How much fighting these cliffs have borne witness to. From the Romans and the Vikings, Napoleon, and the Great War. It seems this huge chalk wall has served as a barrier for the rest of the country since time immemorial. I've been trying to find out what's going on from the soldiers who've been billeted in our guest house. They're nice enough, but I don't think they know any more than we do. Or at least they're very good at keeping secrets. All they say is we have nothing to worry about, so long as we get to the tunnels when the siren sounds. Charlie doesn't like me talking to the troops. He says soldiers can't be trusted. Sometimes I do it just to tease him. Thursday, 8th of August, 1940. Mum is furious. She shouted at me for a full half hour. "You're so selfish, Eva. For all I knew, you could have been dead." She's overreacting, of course. Charlie and I were up on the East Cliff for barely 10 minutes. I know it was dangerous, but this might be the last chance I get to see Charlie for a while. He's volunteered to join the RAF, and he'll find out where he's posted soon. We stood and watched a dogfight take place over the channel. A couple of German planes. I think Charlie said they were Messerschmitts, hounded by a squadron of Spitfires. Our boys shot one of them down. He landed somewhere near Deal, I think. But Charlie and I lost sight of the rest of them after that. It was quite a thrill. We would have stayed out there longer, but the guard on watch saw us, so we rushed off before he gave us an earful. Charlie said we should have gone up on the West Cliff. They don't bother you so much up there. He said sometimes there's a whole line of people standing along the railings watching. I listened to Charlie talk about different planes and manoeuvres. It was like watching Harry, so animated and enthused by it all. But it strikes me it could so easily have been one of our boys who'd been shot down. I daren't say anything to Charlie, though. I don't want to dampen his spirits just before he sets off. He's still caught up in the romance of it all. I don't know. Sometimes it doesn't seem real. When I think about it, I feel quite bad about being so pleased to see the German plane go down. But as Charlie says, if we don't stop them, then what's to prevent the Nazis from invading Britain? And if they do that, what's to say what they'll do to us? The quicker we crush the Jerrys, the better, Charlie says. Of course, I made the mistake of repeating that to Mum. She says Charlie's a bad influence and I shouldn't get too attached to him. But what else is there for us to do now? It's been an awful summer. There's barbed wire all over the beach. The lower East Cliff and most of the harbour are out of bounds. It's so sad to see concrete blocks and barbed wire in place of deck chairs and sandcastles. To think that last summer we had almost 20,000 people sitting on the sands eating iced buns at Mayor Kemp's tea party. Let's hope that was Ramsgate's last invasion. Saturday, 24th of August, 1940. I have truly never been so terrified in all my life. Since the early hours of this morning, Ramsgate has been under attack from wave after wave of German bombers. Unlike before, they have not limited their attacks to the harbour and Manson airfield, but instead Hitler's chosen to bomb our town. Mum and I had just managed to reach the tunnel entrance at Liverpool Lawn when we saw the bombers approaching. There was a large explosion and for a moment everything went black. Eventually the wardens arrived with some gas lamps. Those who didn't make it into the tunnels in time had to find temporary shelter elsewhere and made their way down when they had a chance. Quite a few arrived with scratches and cuts from the flying glass and debris. We did our best to patch them up, but the sight of injured friends and neighbours and the continual bombing put Mum in hysterics. She kept on saying, "What if Dad didn't make it? What if he's still out there?" Mrs. Parks did her best to try and calm her down, and I agreed to walk through to the St. Luke's entrance to see if I could find him. I hadn't realised how vast the tunnels were. There are benches and bunks stretching far underground, but the smell, my word, the smell that pours out of those chemical toilets seemed to chase me all the way to St. Luke's entrance. It took me around half an hour to get there, by which time the all clear had been sounded and I was glad to be out in the open again. I walked out of the tunnels and onto the recreation ground next to the gasworks. The works were cloaked in thick smoke and flames, and the workshop was flattened. I feared the worst, but after what seemed an age, I found out that Dad and his co-workers had made it safely to the Anderson shelter behind the offices. When he finally appeared, I hardly recognized him. He was caked from head to toe in thick dust, but neither he nor his friends had a scratch on them. As Dad and I walked back to the guest house, the true extent of the damage became clear. The mews are completely wrecked, and while Bell Alliance Square looks to have avoided the worst of it, Cottage Road is completely impassable. Yet the other thing that sticks in my head was a canary, sitting in his cage singing, a tiny burst of yellow amongst the rubble. Many of the buildings and guest houses on Albion Place have been ripped apart, a few beyond repair. There were people rummaging through the wreckage as they tried to retrieve items from their bombed-out homes. They'll have no choice than to move into the caves for a while. As for our guest house on Kent Place, not even a cracked window. Mum was there waiting for us. She was so pale. Dad joked that he had survived the bombs only to be squeezed to death when he got home. Mum had left the tunnels via the Queen Street exit and said that Vice had burnt to the ground. I wonder, had Charlie not enlisted, if I would be hugging him right now, or if we would be picking him out from the rubble. Wherever he is, I do hope he's safe. Tuesday, 3rd of March, 1942. I awoke this morning to find a thick sheet of cloud covering the town. It's still cold outside, and there was a bit of wind coming up off the sea. Dad had already left for work, and after tearing down the guest beds for our soldier friends, I decided to go on a long walk along the West Cliff. When I got there, I bumped into Marjorie. She was wearing an ATS uniform. She looked really smart. She told me she's going to be stationed at Dover and said I should sign up and join her. I didn't think any more of it until later this evening, after Dad got home. He had a copy of the London Gazette. I've torn out one of the dispatches because I want to show it to Charlie. I don't think he'll believe it otherwise. 6 World War I biplanes taking on an entire fleet of Jerry's ships and aircraft. Such bravery. The dogged determination of our boys against insurmountable odds is an inspiration.
Admiralty, Whitehall, 3rd of March 1942. The King has been graciously pleased to approve the grant of the Victoria Cross for valour and resolution in action against the enemy to the late Lieutenant Commander A. Eugene Esmond, DSO, Royal Navy. On the morning of Thursday, the 12th of February 1942, Lieutenant Commander Esmond, in command of a squadron of the Fleet Air Arm, was told that the German battlecruisers Scharnhorst and Gneisenau and the cruiser Prince Eugene, strongly escorted by some 30 surface craft, were entering the Straits of Dover, and that his squadron must attack before they reached the sandbanks northeast of Calais. Lieutenant Commander Esmond knew well that his enterprise was desperate. Soon after noon, he and his squadron of 6 swordfish set course for the enemy, and after 10 minutes' flight were attacked by a strong force of enemy fighters. Touch was lost with his fighter escort, and in the action which followed, all his aircraft were damaged. He flew on, cool and resolute, serenely challenging hopeless odds to encounter the deadly fire of the battlecruisers and their escort, which shattered the port wing of his aircraft. Undismayed, he led his squadron on, straight through this inferno of fire, in steady flight towards their target. Almost at once, he was shot down. But his squadron went on to launch a gallant attack, in which at least one torpedo is believed to have struck the German battlecruisers, and from which not one of the 6 aircraft returned. His high courage and splendid resolution will live on in the traditions of the Royal Navy, and remain for many generations a fine and stirring memory.
I wonder how Charlie's doing. I've not heard from him since the 8th of February. He used to write every week without fail. I do hope he's okay. One thing's certain, though. Today's events have convinced me that I can't spend the rest of this war making beds and cups of tea. Marjorie's right. We all have a part to play. I've made the decision to volunteer. There was an announcement in the Gazette, and I will travel to Chatham tomorrow to enlist. It will mean leaving Ramsgate, but I don't mind. Mum says I'd serve the cause better working at Hudson Flour Mill. But I was a bright girl at school, and I haven't really done much since I left Clarendon. I can't wait to see the look on Charlie's face when he sees me in uniform. I do hope I hear from him soon. Wednesday, 7th of June, 1944. I'd been granted a few days' leave, so decided to pay Mum and Dad a visit. There was a real surprise waiting for me when I arrived at Ramsgate Station. Harry's back. He's almost as tall as Dad now. I certainly wasn't expecting such a strong hug from my not-so-little brother. He could compete with Dad on that front. The atmosphere in town has changed so much since I was last here. There's a real excitement in the air following the Normandy landings yesterday. Harry says the town was filled with soldiers. There were Marines on motorbikes, military vehicles lining the roads, tanks, guns, lorries. Every available square inch is currently packed with tents and field kitchens. We're not sure why they've not started to disembark yet, but Dad thinks they may be the backup forces. Back at the guest house, Mum handed me a small pile of letters. There was one from Marjorie, a couple from old school friends of mine, and strangely an invitation to interview. I suspect Mum's been trying to find me a job so that I'll come home. But there's still no word from Charlie. No one has heard from him for some time now. Dad says I should prepare for the worst. It's been 2 years, and no one's heard anything. He can't simply vanish. Someone must know something. I can't bear to think of it. If anything's happened to Charlie, I don't think I'll ever get over it. Harry, bless him, has been trying to keep my mind off it. He was telling me all about the farm in Staffordshire, but he got bored quite quickly and wanted to know about what I've been doing in the Women's Auxiliary Air Force. I told him everything, from the first interview in Chatham when they asked me if I could read a map, to sending up the weather balloon during my meteorological training in London. But his favourite story, even more than me bumping into Churchill in the map room, was the one about my mystery posting. After I'd completed my training, I was sent to Debden, where we were lined up and all handed slips of paper with our destinations on them. Everyone else had something like Hawking or Shoreham or Wittering, but mine simply said PFF. I asked the commanding officer what PFF stood for, and he told me he didn't know. It was classified information, but that I would shortly be transferred to Witten. On arrival at Witten, I again showed the commanding officer my papers, and again he said he didn't know what PFF stood for, but that I was to remain there for further transportation to arrive. I spent a full week in Witten, and was eventually joined by several others. None of us any the wiser. One of the RAF boys said it stood for Pretty Fine Females. I won't write what some of the others said. But in all seriousness, they made us feel at home and were good company. It was quite a thrill to see them take off the runway, but your heart was in your mouth whilst they were gone. We'd rush out and count them in when they returned. Even though we were all perfect strangers, I can't even begin to explain the sense of relief I felt when they arrived home safely, or the heartache when they didn't. When I did finally leave Whitton, there were 12 of us. We set off in a convoy of cars and were escorted to Castle Hill House in Huntingdon. I've been posted there ever since. I'm not allowed to talk about my job really, but what I will say is they know the whereabouts of every plane and every pilot that takes off from Whitton Airfield. So if anything has happened to Charlie, someone would have heard something by now. I hope.
Yesterday morning at 2:41 a.m. at General Eisenhower's headquarters, General Jodl signed the act of unconditional surrender of all German land, sea, and air forces in Europe to the Allied Expeditionary Force and simultaneously to the Soviet High Command. The German war is therefore at an end.
Tuesday, 8th of May, 1945. It's finally happened. Germany surrendered. There's been a growing feeling that the war was coming to an end, but Churchill's announcement on the radio this afternoon has sent everyone into a frenzy. I don't have the words to explain how I'm feeling right now. It's been such an emotional night. This evening we attended a Thanksgiving service at the Sailors' Church. When we came out, the harbour was filled with lights and crowds cheering everywhere I turned. We walked back along the quay, weaving through the celebrations, and the ships in the harbour started to fire rockets and machine guns out to sea, creating an impromptu firework display. Our progress through the harbour was slow, for everyone wanted to hug, shake hands, or share a drink. By the time we managed to reach Madeira Walk, Dad's face was plush red, and Mum had hard work trying to keep him upright. It was around this time we got separated. Harry had disappeared with his friends, and I'd been swept up in the excitement. I found myself outside the pavilion. A huge crowd of people were dancing in the street outside the entrance. Occasionally I encountered a familiar face from the town, but the war has brought so many new people to the area and sent others overseas, across Europe and beyond, that in that moment I could have been anywhere in the country. It didn't matter. We all rejoiced together. It was both surreal and familiar. As the sun set, I continued to dance with friends and strangers alike, until I felt a hand on my shoulder. I turned, laughing, and then froze. I don't know what it was. Perhaps the general sense of euphoria, the drinking, the dizziness, but I shook it off at first. I told myself I was imagining things. But it was him. The same grey eyes, that mottled brown hair. My Charlie. I couldn't speak. Still now I can barely write it. But there he was, my Charlie. He just smiled at me and then asked me to dance. And we did. We danced, we laughed, we cried, and we swore we would never be parted again.